Are you also tired of one-size-fits-all weight loss plans? Meet Noom, the personalized solution that meets you where you are. Noom is able to understand your unique needs, from dietary restrictions to medical concerns. Unlike restrictive programs, Noom embraces your lifestyle and choices. Discover a sustainable approach to weight loss, tailored just for you. Honestly, Noom felt like it was made for me. It's not just about what I eat, it's about understanding why. With Noom, I've learned so much about myself and built healthier habits that stick. It's all about progress, not perfection. Say goodbye to restrictive diets and experience the Noom app for yourself with personalized lessons and expert coaching. Noom's psychology and biology-based approach has helped over 5.2 million people achieve their goals. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom's psychology and biology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold. Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and in this episode, we will be covering the final Parker Pyne short story, The Regatta Mystery. I will be joined in the second part of this episode by Michelle Kazmer, who is an esteemed scholar of Agatha Christie. We had such a fantastic conversation about Parker Pyne and Agatha Christie, and I'm so excited to share it with you. So I just want to dive into my summary of this short story so that we can get to it. Starting, but of course, with the publication history. This is a rather complicated one, and on the one hand, I suppose it's a symptom of the fact that I now have so many friends in the know who I can consult about the finer points of publication history. With great knowledge comes great power, and with great power, great responsibility. I have to thank both Tony Medawar and John Curran for fielding various questions I had about the publication history of this short story, because we have an unusual situation here in that there are 2 versions of the Regatta Mystery. One of them features Parker Pyne, and the other features Hercule Poirot. So the first version of the story to be published is the Poirot version. It appeared in the Edmonton Observer in Canada on the 2nd of May, 1936, and then the next day in the New York Sunday News. I do know that it was also published in the Chicago Tribune. Per Tony Medawar, many of Christie's short stories were first published in the U.S. in the New York Daily or Sunday News, and then in other papers around the country. Tony was actually kind enough to share a screenshot of this story with me as it appeared in the New York Sunday News. And it has this delightful subheading: "The riddle of a theft in jest which turns into a professional robbery." That is a very informative subheading, perhaps a little too informative, actually. It's nigh spoilery. I would also just like to note that this New York Sunday News version of the story features an illustration of Poirot, and he looks a little bit like a young Mandy Patinkin. He has not just a full and luxuriant mustache, but Kel Horror, a full beard as well. I will try to screenshot that image and post it on social media for your viewing pleasure. So anyway, the Poirot version of the short story was also published in the UK in the Strand magazine 1 month later in June of 1936. And it wasn't until 3 years later that the Parker Pyne version of the story appeared in the US book collection, The Regatta Mystery and Other Stories, our titular story. We've got another titular/eponymous short story here. That collection was, of course, published by Dodd Mead in June of 1939. Janet Morgan actually incorrectly cites this story's appearance within the Regatta Mystery Book Collection as being a Poirot short story. She almost never makes a mistake, that Janet Morgan. And this is obviously a very odd situation, a short story that seemingly started out as a Poirot, ending up as a Parker Pyne. It's actually quite easy to read the Poirot story as well. It is available as an ebook, a little digital bonbon of a short story that will set you back a mere 99 cents to download. That is what I did, reading the Poirot version immediately after reading the Parker Pyne version. And the Parker Pyne version is actually the final short story in my Parker Pyne Investigates collection, even though as first published, the Parker Pyne Investigates collection did not include the Regatta Mystery, or even indeed the penultimate Parker Pyne short story Catherine and I already covered, Problem at Pollensa Bay. But the modern day Parker Pyne Investigates just adds those two, because why not, right? It showcases every single Parker Pyne that we have, which is not many when we're comparing him at least to the likes of Poirot. And that is exactly what we're doing here, because we have these two versions of the short story. So it's not even clear that the story did start out as a Poirot. Per my good friend John Curran, it's actually pretty clear in Christie's notebooks that she conceived of the story as a Parker Pyne vehicle. Apparently, the notes for the Regatta Mystery are the most extensive of any that exist for a Parker Pyne short story. And in those notes, Mrs. Oliver even gets a mention. Let's never forget that she, like Miss Lemon, makes her first appearance in the Christieverse by way of Parker Pyne before settling in Poirot's world. And yet, given the fact that the Poirot version appeared first, I'd still say it's an open question. And it's one that Michelle and I will also be discussing later in the episode. So I'll leave the issue of provenance there for now. And just note that this 1939 U.S. book collection, The Regatta Mystery and Other Stories, was actually used to come up with the number 50 for the publication of A Murder is Announced. As you may remember, back when we covered that novel, Collins wanted to be able to say that A Murder is Announced was Christie's 50th title published in 1950. It had a nice ring to it. And to get to that number, they actually counted this U.S. book collection. And then they did that again, counting the collection to get to the number 80 for the publication of Passenger to Frankfurt, so that they could claim Christie was publishing her 80th title on her 80th birthday in 1970. So I love that this 1939 U.S. collection was actually a crucial title for purposes of marketing and publicity on the part of Christie's UK publisher, Collins. The story did end up being collected in a few UK books over the years. In Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World, my good friend Mark Aldridge includes a reproduction of a book cover that reads Poirot and the Regatta Mystery. And that must have been a very slim volume because it only cost 6 pence. That's the price printed at the bottom of the cover. That book came out in 1946, which apparently was a banner year for the Regatta Mystery in England because the story was also included in Poirot Lends a Hand, which is a rare book collection published in 1946 that includes both the Regatta Mystery and Problem at Pollensa Bay, which is curious to me since Problem at Pollensa Bay is a Parker Pyne short story. And as far as I know, there was never a Poirot version of the story written, though if anyone out there, say Mark Aldridge, whenever he is listening to this episode, would like to clarify the matter, I am all ears. This short story also ended up being published in the much maligned 13 for Luck collection, which was published in 1966 in the UK. That collection was aimed at younger readers and much maligned by Christie herself, who never approved it and was mightily miffed when it came out. And it was also collected in Problem at Pollensa Bay and Other Stories, which was published in the UK in 1991.
I would like to talk about our victim, who is Mr. Isaac Points, a man of 58 in good health and condition with perhaps a slight tendency to liver. Okie doke. You may not be surprised to learn, given his name, that Christie makes note of his, quote, dark and slightly oriental face. Big sigh. Oh, Agatha. Mr. Points is a rich businessman who has been hosting a party of people. First on his yacht, the Mermaid, and later in a reception room in the Royal George, which is a fancy hotel in Dartmouth Harbor, just a bit south of Torquay, in Christie's beloved home county of Devonshire. And fun fact, which I learned from John Curran, but this hotel actually exists. John told me that he remembers having lunch there with a group of Christie fans many years ago, overlooking the harbor. And sign me up for that event, if it ever happens again. I did a little online digging, and the real-life hotel dates from the 17th century. That's right, it's almost 400 years old. It's called the Royal Castle Hotel. And not only is it the site of this short story, it was also used as a location in the film adaptation of Ordeal by Innocence, starring Donald Sutherland. That adaptation, you may remember, was filmed on location in Devon and made great use of its setting, with that opening shot of Sutherland on the River Dart as a particularly memorable sequence. I can still see him in his boat. According to Wikipedia, so take this with a grain of salt, guests at the Royal Castle have included Queen Victoria, many of Charles II's mistresses, and Mary II, as in William and. Also Edward VII, much more modern royal, and Cary Grant, who I consider American royalty, so that fits in quite nicely. You couldn't be anything other than royalty with a chin dimple like that. And of course, Christie herself also stayed at the Royal Castle. Apparently, some of the wooden support beams used in the construction of the hotel are from the wreck of the Spanish Armada, and it's also haunted by an old stagecoach that draws up to the front door in the middle of the night to collect phantom passengers. With all due respect to the Grand Hotel in Torquay, which is where I stayed for the International Agatha Christie Festival, I think I may need to spend at least a night or two at this hotel when I go back for the festival next September, which I do have every intention of doing. I'll see you there. Okay, where was I? Right, Mr. Isaac Points. I said he was a rich businessman. He is specifically a rich diamond merchant who has his prized diamond, the Morning Star, stolen from right under his nose. Literally. That's right, we have a jewel heist to contend with here, listeners. Not a murder mystery, alas, but this one is a lot of fun and features some clever Christie tricks. I quite enjoyed it. I should note that we have a secondary victim, who is Mr. Evan Llewellyn, a dark young Welshman with, quote, a faintly hungry, wolfish look about him, which some women found attractive. That made me think of Philip Bocini from the Forsyte Saga, played by Iowan Griffith in the recent-ish adaptation, the one that also features Damian Lewis as Soames Forsyte. In any case, Evan Llewellyn is convinced that everyone else thinks he stole the diamond, and this is why Llewellyn goes to Parker Pyne, or Hercule Poirot, depending on the version you're reading, in the attempt to get at the truth to clear his name. But perhaps Mr. Llewellyn is just bluffing, which is why I'm going to go ahead and mark him down as the first of our suspects. So there, Evan Llewellyn. Let's move on to our second suspect, who is Leo Stein. That would be Isaac Points' business partner. So he is a fellow diamond merchant. Could he perhaps have such a hunger for diamonds that he wants the Morning Star all for himself? Next up, we have Sir George and Lady Marroway. They are a married couple, and they really do come as a pair. They, quote, came from a different world, the world of Antibes and Juan Le Pin, of golf at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, of bathing from the rocks at Madeira in the winter. In other words, they come from Mr. Satterthwaite's world. I'll bet you anything Mr. Satterthwaite knows them. Maybe not, actually, since Mr. Satterthwaite only knows la crème de la crème. And as Christie so exquisitely notes, in outward seeming, they were as the lilies that toiled not, neither did they spin. But perhaps this was not quite true. There are diverse ways of toiling and also of spinning. And I guess this is a short story full of lots of literary references for me, but I was getting major Lily Bart vibes from Sir George and Lady Marroway here. Poverty comes in many forms, doesn't it? Especially among fictional literary characters. Our next suspect is Mr. Samuel Leathern, an American business acquaintance of Mr. Points's, quote, a tall, fair, dyspeptic-looking man with a somewhat mournful expression. We also have Eve Leathern. That would be Mr. Leathern's schoolgirl daughter, and I'm quoting again here. She was 15, an awkward child, but full of vitality. Let's remember that verbatim description. Finally, we have Mrs. Janet Rustington, who may or may not have feelings for young Evan Llewellyn, but she, quote, did not wear her heart on her sleeve. She had married young, and the marriage had ended in disaster in less than a year. Since that time, it was difficult to know what Janet Rustington thought of anyone or anything. Her manner was always the same, charming, but completely aloof. I'm definitely getting a whiff of Helen Graham, or is that Helen Huntington, vibes from The Tenant of Wildfell Hall here. I told you this story was packed with literary references for me. That, of course, would be the second and final novel by Anne and Peggy Bronte. Let's move right along into the world as it appears to be. We open on this party having just come ashore from Mr. Points' yacht, the Mermaid, since this is the Regatta mystery, after all. And even though this is probably the last time I will say the words yacht and regatta, Christie does at least set the scene appropriately in her opening pages here. They're at a fair beside the harbor where they've partaken of coconut shies, fat ladies, the human spider, and the merry-go-round. So I obviously know what merry-go-rounds are, and I'm familiar with the rather stuck-in-its-time phenomenon of having a, quote, fat lady at a fair. I feel like I should know what coconut shies are, but I will be honest with you, I have never actually bothered to look it up or figure it out until I came across the phrase here in this story. In case you too need to be enlightened as to what a coconut shy actually is, it's a game whereby wooden balls are thrown at coconuts, balanced on a post, and if you knock down all the coconuts, you win a prize. The prize might actually be the coconuts, or it could be something else. And shy here refers to a toss or a throw, not to any sort of bashfulness. So fair enough. But what is the human spider? And please God, let it have nothing to do with the human centipede, which I will not be clipping here. From what I can gather, the human spider is an optical illusion in which a person's head is superimposed on a spider's body. If you have any more information or insight to shed on the human spider phenomenon at a carnival, please write in and let me know. I am as curious about it as I ever am about all throwaway references in Christie that befuddle me. So the only person who's into all this carny stuff is the teenaged Eve Leathern, who forces them to stay a little longer so she can get her fortune told by the, quote, real gypsy in the caravan, end quote. I will just pause to acknowledge, as Catherine and I did on our Endless Night episode, that the term gypsy is an outdated way to refer to a member of the Roma or Romani people. Eve gets her fortune told, and then the party makes their way to the Royal George, aka the Royal Castle Hotel. And it seems like they do so on the yacht, by the way, since Christie writes that the party steered its way to the Royal George. So look at that. I was able to say the word yacht again, after all. They're then shown into a private room on the first floor of the hotel. American second floor, as a reminder. It has a big round table in it and a big bulging bow window that opens onto the harbor square. Mr. Points insists on shutting the window since the fair below them is too noisy. And then he surveys the group he's assembled here with the fatuous satisfaction Christie ascribes to him at several points throughout this story. I got the feeling Christie didn't have much admiration or even respect for Mr. Isaac Points. And I hate to say that his religion could have anything to do with this, but unfortunately, I think it might. He is without a doubt a Jewish character, and we know that Christie had a habit of depicting such characters in a way that strikes us here in the 21st century as very much stuck in its time. Some of his private thoughts about his guests are quite funny, however. Here's his take on the American Samuel Leathern. Old Leathern wasn't a bad fellow, long-winded, of course, like most Americans, fond of telling endless long stories. Hey, guilty as charged. And he had that disconcerting habit of requiring precise information. What was the population of Dartmouth? In what year had the Naval College been built? And so on. Expected his host to be a kind of walking Baedeker. I very much enjoyed that. Eve Leathern does much better in Points' view, except that he notes her voice is, quote, rather like a corncrake. Though in my edition of this story, it says corncake, which is officially one of the funniest typos I've ever come across. A corncrake is a kind of bird, and here through the magic of YouTube is what it sounds like. So that's a very unpleasant sound. I know of one other time Christie used this comparison to a corncrake to describe a person's voice, which was in The Hollow, when Midge's boss, who is older and Jewish, is described as having such a voice. It's an unpleasant reference, but this corncrake business will actually turn out to be significant. So let's just note that. We also learn that apparently both Evan Llewellyn and Janet Rustington are writers, which is interesting since there seems to be a romance blossoming between these two. And I think it's pretty unusual to depict two writers falling in love. I mean, let's be honest, writers tend to hate each other. I mean, for every Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett, shout out yet again to the Barretts of Wimpole Street, there are at least a dozen Jonathan Franzen and Jennifer Wieners out there. I'm just saying. Anyway, dinner is served here in this room at the Royal George, starting with a course of hot mackerel. And Eve Leathern starts asking in her childlike, impish way about this massive diamond that Mr. Points showed them the night before. He said he carries it with him everywhere. And Eve says that while she was in bed last night, she thought of a real cute way to steal this diamond while it's being passed around among the members of this very party, which she thinks will stump everyone. So Mr. Points bets her half a dozen pairs of the finest nylon stockings that she won't be able to pull it off. He first tries to bet half a dozen pairs of gloves, but she's like, ugh, who wears gloves anymore? Mr. Points is so out of date. That's what Eve will get if she wins this bet. And if Mr. Points wins, she will have to get him a new tobacco pouch. So Mr. Points takes the Morning Star from out of an inner pocket. We don't ever really get a very specific description of the diamond, but my guess is that it's somewhere around the size of a grape, if not a little bigger. He hands this gem to Lady Marroway, who hands it to Mr. Leathern, who hands it to Evan Llewellyn. Then at this point, two waiters who are serving them come in to collect the dishes from that first course of hot mackerel, and they put down plates for the next course and leave. Llewellyn then passes the diamond to Leo Stein, who passes it to Eve Leathern, and Eve drops it. She pretends that it's by accident, but everyone knows she, of course, did this on purpose. This must have to do with the ruse that she has concocted to secrete this diamond somewhere. Eventually, everyone except for Mr. Points joins in the search for the diamond on the floor. A glass gets swept off the table amid all this confusion. But the diamond has disappeared, and this all seems to be according to Eve's plan. She uses a highly artificial voice as she exclaims, "Where can it have rolled to? I can't find it anywhere." So then Lady Marroway and Mrs. Rustington strip search Eve, no, really, behind a screen in the room. And while this is happening, Evan Llewellyn flings open a window and throws a coin down to a news vendor out on the harbor, and the news vendor throws him up a paper in return. Predictably, the diamond is not on Eve's person, at which point Eve puts her hands on her hips and says to Points, "What about it, big boy?" This actually isn't the first time we've come across the phrase big boy in a Parker Pyne short story. It was also used in Problem at Palenza Bay. I suppose this is evidence of the lightness of tone Christie often strikes in these stories. It is the 1930s, after all, and these characters are all supposed to be having a lark. But that lark is about to go south because Points now has the table stripped and even turned upside down. But of course, the diamond is nowhere to be seen.
In the New York Sunday News version of this story, there's a fantastic illustration, actually, of the table being turned on its side and the cast of characters assembled around it. We have the rather large backside of either Isaac Points or Leo Stein. They are both described as wearing yachting regalia since they've been attending a regatta after all. And the illustrator had a lot of fun with these costumes and the frenzied search for the diamond. I will try to post that illustration as well on social media.
A triumphant Eve, after confirming those 6 nylon stockings are hers, runs over to her little black evening bag, at which point she deflates. Because, you see, this bag of hers, a pochette, as she calls it, used to have a big paste stone in the middle of the clasp, roughly the same size as the diamond. And this paste stone fell out the night before. So Eve's idea was to use a little bit of plasticine she just happened to have on her to affix the diamond to the clasp right after she dropped it. And in this way, the diamond would be hiding in plain sight on the outside of her bag. But now, gulp, the diamond is gone. Obviously, this has just gotten a lot more serious. So now it's strip search time for everyone. The ladies strip search each other. The gentlemen do the same. But we know where this is headed. The diamond is nowhere to be seen. Or as Christie puts it, the Morning Star had vanished into space. And unfortunately, the prime suspect is Evan Llewellyn because he bought that newspaper, which seems to be the only time there is any sort of interaction between the occupants of this room and the outside world. Llewellyn could have thrown the diamond to the newspaper vendor along with his coin, for instance. And even more unfortunately, he has just come into a bit of money from some lucky bets he placed at the racetrack in the days following this mishap. And that looks very suspicious to the police, who have come sniffing around him in their investigations in the aftermath of the disappearance of the Morning Star. Evan Llewellyn wouldn't even mind that, but there is one person whose opinion he very much cares about, and that would be Janet Rustington. If she suspects him of wrongdoing, she will have nothing to do with him, given how burned she was by her rotter of a husband. So what we have here is a potentially innocent party suffering under the cloud of guilt that will persist unless the mystery is solved. That is to say, an Agatha Christie special, be it Hercule Poirot or Parker Pyne, who eventually solves this mystery and allows the innocent to live guilt-free. Fortunately for Llewellyn, he has the presence of mind to consult Hercule Poirot / Parker Pyne, both excellent choices and both equally capable of solving this seemingly locked room heist mystery. And I'll just say this, but I think it's another point in favor of the argument that the Poirot version was written first. But I believe this is the only Parker Pyne story that doesn't reproduce any of that newspaper advertisement of Parker Pyne's. Are you happy? If not, consult Mr. Parker Pyne. Llewellyn references the advertisement in passing, but to me, the Pyne version of this story feels like a bit of a rush job. And I think that might be some textual evidence for that fact. Anyway, before Poirot or Pyne tells us the solution, let's see if we can muddle our way through on our own with a bridge of clues. Clue number one has to do with that corncrake voice. Now, why would a 15-year-old have a voice like a corncrake, which is usually ascribed to much older people? As I mentioned, Christie would go on to describe the voice of a much older character as sounding like a corncrake in The Hollow. Well, the deduction there is that Eve Leathern may not be as young as she appears. At the very least, we should be suspicious of her for having a corncrake voice. And hey, isn't she the one who proposed this whole little experiment here that led to the diamond's disappearance in the first place? She's portrayed as this innocent kid who's just trying to impress everyone and has unfortunately allowed a bad thing to happen. And she bursts into tears and she feels so much regret when everything goes badly. And, we're meant to feel sympathetic for her. But an astute reader may not be fooled by all this sympathy Christie is begging us to feel for Eve Leathern. Clue number two. Plasticine. We've seen plasticine play a significant role in other Christie mysteries, in the archaeological settings of Murder in Mesopotamia and a former Parker Pyne short story, The Pearl of Price. I don't think it would be unusual for plasticine to be hanging around an archaeological site, so we know why Christie then was familiar with it. But why does the 15-year-old Eve Leathern just happen to have some plasticine on her? Without that plasticine, she never would have been able to put her ill-advised scheme into action. So the deduction here is, again, that we should just be taking a closer look at Eve Leathern and not necessarily trusting the way in which she is portrayed. Clue number three, and this really is the heart of this mystery. Oh, how I wish Catherine were still here, because if she were, she would be taking this clue. Say it with me, listeners. Never underestimate the help. Remember how there are two waiters flitting about the edges of this story? Well, the deduction is that it seems as though we have a locked room mystery on our hands here. But do we? Didn't the waiters come in and out of the room early on in the proceedings when that diamond was being passed around from person to person around the table? Does that mean that perhaps one of those two waiters could have had something to do with the disappearance of the diamond? We shall see as we move on into the world as it actually is. So I will say that there are two more crucial pieces of information we learn during Evan Llewellyn's consultation with Poirot / Pyne, which is that when the wine glass was swept off the table, it broke. per Llewellyn. It was knocked off the table and then it got stepped on. We also learned that the glass was Eve Leathern's. So that's very interesting. Poirot/Pyne tells Llewellyn to come back in 3 days, at which point all will be known because, of course, it will. So Llewellyn returns, and the detective, whose name begins with a P, informs his client that all is well. His good name has been preserved, and the Amalfi gang have been arrested. Turns out that Samuel Leathern is actually Old Amalfi, an Italian-American who poses as an American businessman to introduce himself to prominent figures in the jewel business, and who then steals from these people with the help of his son and daughter-in-law, Pietro and Maria. Though, as Detective P notes, there's some doubt as to whether Pietro and Maria are even really married. I'm quoting now from the text. Maria Amalfi played the part of his daughter. Amazing creature, 27 at least, and nearly always plays a part of 16. I think this is one of those Christie tricks that works a lot better on the page than it would on the screen, since it involves some costuming and I would imagine makeup as well. Though perhaps we should have known Eve wasn't a real child since she didn't practice voodoo like the teenaged children in both Evil Under the Sun and Spider's Web. Also, did Lady Marroway or Mrs. Rustington not look at her knees during the 2 strip searches that Eve/Maria endured? Per Cat Among the Pigeons, those knees should have been dusty, craggy messes, given that she was 27 years old. But I digress. The trick here is immensely simple, though difficult to ferret out, as so many Christie tricks are. We're told that Samuel Leathern, aka Old Amalfi, handled the stone before the waiters came in to take away the first course. Remember when it was being passed around, he was the second one to hold it. At that point, Amalfi, using some sleight of hand, affixed the real diamond to the underside of his plate, which was then taken out of the room by one of those 2 waiters, who was Pietro. Pietro had been hired as an extra waiter at the hotel during this busy period. And then the diamond that Eve dropped was a paste replica, and she smashed that paste replica under her shoe along with the wine glass she deliberately swiped off the table. No one noticed that there were extra slivers of glass once the wine glass was broken, and that's believable enough. And in this way, voila, the diamond is out of the room. The replica has been destroyed before any of the multiple searches made in this seemingly locked room. Very clever little criminal trick. I found it quite pleasing. We end, appropriately enough, either for Papa Poirot or Parker Pyne heart specialist, on the vindicated Evan Llewellyn rushing away from Detective P and heading for his lady love. Here are the final lines of the story. He hailed a taxi and gave the address of Janet Rustington's flat. He felt in a mood to carry all before him. The end.
This episode is sponsored by The Art of Crime, a brand new history podcast about the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts, which I believe is going to be very much up many listeners' alleys. Season 1 of the podcast is titled The Unusual Suspects, Artists Accused of Being Jack the Ripper. It profiles 6 renowned artists who have fallen under suspicion as the Whitechapel murderer. One of them is Lewis Carroll, as in, yes, that Lewis Carroll, so that's fascinating. If you're like me, you never knew that Lewis Carroll was accused of being Jack the Ripper. You haven't even listened to an episode of this podcast yet, and already your mind is being blown here. So as you meet each artist episode by episode, you will find out who they were, what it was like for them to ply their trades back in the Victorian period, and why they have been nominated as candidates for Jack the Ripper. You'll also get to ponder why artists, especially great artists, have proven so attractive as murder suspects, which brings ye olde actor klaxon alarm bell to mind for me. As I said, I think you're going to enjoy this podcast. It has significant overlap with All About Agatha. So subscribe today wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to visit www.artofcrimepodcast.com. We have no adaptations of the Regatta mystery, sadly, but happily, it is now time for me to introduce my co-host for the remainder of this episode. I'm so glad to be able to introduce you to another core and key agathologist out there in the world of scholarship surrounding Agatha Christie. Michelle Kazmer is a professor of information science at Florida State University. And since 2014, she has maintained a scholarly agenda in crime and detective fiction focused on our beloved Agatha Christie. She generally takes an information science approach to her many analyses of Christie, and I'm very curious what that exactly means. So I will be asking her that in just a moment. Michelle has presented on a panel at the BBC World Forum with friend of the podcast, Mark Aldridge, and the current chairman and CEO of Agatha Christie Limited, James Pritchard, who just so happens to be Agatha Christie's great-grandson. She has written and delivered so many conference papers, book chapters, and lectures about Christie, and is a fixture in the best of ways on the Agatha Christie scholarly circuit. My former co-host, Catherine Brobeck, and I first met Michelle when we delivered a paper at Cambridge University at the Agatha Christie conference all the way back in 2017. So she is a listener and a supporter who goes way back. It is such a pleasure to have her on today to discuss our final Parker Pyne short story, The Regatta Mystery, and just to take stock of the Pyne oeuvre overall. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Kemper. I am delighted and incredibly grateful to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
I'm curious, what does an information science approach to Agatha Christie look like? How does that differ from other approaches?
Sure. That was sort of my calling card when Jamie Bernthal did the very first Agatha conference back in 2014 in Exeter. And he put out a call for papers. And I think he expected kind of a few people from within the UK. And he got this giant global avalanche of abstracts. And he sort of paused at mine and said, you know, what does it mean to take an information science behavior approach? So information science is a big field, and it has some really technical components and some more social science behavioral components. And that's the piece that I bring to the table. So I was really excited about the opportunity to approach Agatha Christie from a scholarly perspective when, like all of us, I had been a fan for decades at that point. Mm-hmm. And I realized that detection, among many other things, is an information behavior. And information behavior is one of the things that we study in information science. So people do a lot of things with information, right? They keep it, they create it, they organize it, they create metadata around it, they collect it, they search for it, retrieve it, avoid it, hide from it and hide it, they hoard it, they distribute it. There are all kinds of things that they do with respect to information. Mm-hmm. And from what I could see at that point, there weren't a lot of people out there in the world taking that approach of how does detection look like in information behavior. So I started originally with Miss Marple, my first love for sure, and said, well, let's look at how Miss Marple's detection behavior manifests like an information behavior, because my argument really came from there that people have looked at detective fiction, crime fiction, in a lot of ways, why it works. People ask that about Agatha all the time. Why does it work? Why does it always work? Why does it work so well? Mm-hmm. And there are a ton of reasons that it works well that people from different fields have looked at. Oh, it's the writing, it's the puzzles, it's the plot, it's the, it's the readability, it's what have you. And I said, sure, but what if we think about it in yet another additional way? Because those are all really, really, really important. But what if we also say, if the information behavior of the folks in the story and the way they act with respect to the information artifacts and the information content around them, if that doesn't carry verisimilitude to human information behavior the way I experience it in the world, then the detective fiction, the crime fiction isn't going to work. It's one of the things that makes it work for us as readers. So I thought, let's poke into that a little bit. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
I love that. That is so interesting. And it's kind of making sense to me now why you were so excited to talk about Parker Pyne, because he is a statistician. He is very much, I think, probably the on its face, the most information sciencey detective that I can think of in the Christie oeuvre. Of course, your point is that all of these detectives and the stories around them of their detection can be, applied to information science, or rather, information science can be applied to them. But it's really interesting thinking about that, I think, in the context of Parker Pyne.
Absolutely. And when I first started looking at Parker Pyne, that's actually kind of what I wrote down, right? So you've caught me out right away, which I think is great. that kind of the first thing that he is sort of a pure information processing entity,
Yep. I assume that that's one aspect of what you love about Parker Pyne. He's such an odd little corner of the Christieverse. And I have always found myself asking when I read a Parker Pyne story, what exactly makes him tick and how and why he's special? Because I think that we have so much material for Poirot and for Miss Marple that we can usually answer that question. The question will differ depending on who's asking it. Obviously, readers love Poirot for lots of different reasons, and the same goes for Miss Marple. But I'm curious for you, what is it that you love about Parker Pyne, and why do these stories work well, or do they? Parker Pyne is a bit of a controversial figure, I think, in the Christieverse. And, I'd like to just bring up the fact that of course, tragically, Catherine Brobeck isn't here to have this conversation, but we had covered all of the Parker Pyne short stories together, except for this one. And on many of them, she was driven crazy by Parker Pyne, especially in that first batch, the first half of the Parker Pyne Investigates collection, which we liked to call the Miss Lonely Hearts section. Some of those stories don't necessarily age well, especially as to relations between the genders, let us say. And there's just a lot going on in the Parker Pyne stories. So how do you feel about Parker Pyne?
Right. So I think what's really interesting there is that what you just said, there's a lot going on, right? Because in some ways there's not a lot going on. And in fact, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to actually read a little bit from very, very briefly, I promise, and I'll make it interesting. I did a paper on Parker Pyne in Exeter, I think in 2017. Well, while I was actually giving the talk that day, I caused a little sales blip on Amazon UK. While I was actually giving the paper, because people were like, wait, I don't know if I've read these, or can't remember how recently I've read these. I certainly don't have them on Kindle, or I don't have them to hand. And so people started grabbing them. And I said, I want to do an information worlds analysis of these stories. And I said, peering through our information worlds lens, we have precious little to see at first. Just looking at Parker Pyne himself without considering a specific story or plot, we can learn very little. His personal life and backstory are limited to generic information about his government job and some friends he meets up with in service of specific plots he is devising. When he's working from his office, he's supported by a staff of 4, half of whom don't even belong in his world because they belong to another Christie detective. And of his other 2 staff, one of them, we actually know more about her character and personal life than we know about Parker Pyne's. And I think that's all true. In some ways, he's a complete non-entity, which means the stories have to work. The stories have to work for themselves. And I think that you and Catherine were absolutely correct. I think the first ones, the Miss Lonely Hearts stories, are a lot more of a challenge. I think Parker Pyne works significantly better when he's on the road. And in some ways, that makes the Regatta mystery kind of interesting, because the Regatta mystery has him back in England.
Yep.
But not back in his London office with Ariadne Oliver writing the story and Miss Lemon taking care of the logistics. And he doesn't draw on the services of either Claude Luttrell or Madeleine de Serres, right? He's out of his element and traveling, but he's back in England, and that actually adds another piece to the story. I agree. Obviously, I mean, you have to agree. There are so many problematic elements in all of the Parker Pyne stories, including the one we're going to talk about today. I did want to say there was a really funny experience that I had when I was listening to these, both the first time I listened to them when you first recorded them, you and Catherine, and then going back recently and listening to them, which is that, and this I think is I think you're going to gasp when I say this, I adore The Case of the Rich Woman. I always have. It may be my favorite Parker Pyne, definitely my second favorite Parker Pyne if I had to pick one. And the level to which you and Catherine were distressed and dismayed, and I completely got where you were coming from and why. So I sat down to really think about it. Why do I love this story so very much? Given the deep problems that you had, and you referred to it as gaslighting, and she really accused Parker Pyne of absconding with all of Amelia Reimer's money at the end, which I think is a definitely an extra textual interpretation to make there. And so what I kind of noted down to myself is that, in many cases, it has been the position of this podcast that Parker Pyne was lying to his clients, and that has been articulated as being kind of the core problem at hand. And I would say there are many versions of truth. And to say that Parker Pyne tricked or gaslighted Amelia Reimer, I think belies the extent to which she was lied to by capitalism, lied to by consumerism, lied to by her fake friends who didn't really like her and didn't want to spend time with her. So I would say, in many ways, what happens to her money in the end, Parker Pyne, I don't think he absconds with it. I think he's actually telling her the truth, that he's stewarded it quite well, that if she wants it back, she can have it. And if not, then he'll do with it whatever she tells him to do with it. And in the end, though, why is money and the fictional world in which she winds up living and enjoying herself immensely any less valid or valued than the, I would argue, equally artificial world that she was living in before she embarked on her adventure with Parker Pyne, which she asked him to do? She said, I'll pay you money if you make me happy. She paid him money. He did a thing. She wound up happy in the end. And I don't think the position that she wound up in at the end of the story is any less real than the one she was in before she went to see him.
Hey, that is a fair interpretation. And just to jog listeners' memories in case you need some jogging, you can always listen back to our episode on the case of the rich woman. But that is the one where, so I'll be spoiling it now, but that is the one where a rich woman who is just dissatisfied with her life, she obviously has everything material that she could ever want, comes to Parker Pyne. She says, I'm not happy. Will you make me happy? And he says, sure, I will. And in his ingenious way, what he does is that he basically abducts her to a farm where she eventually is brought to appreciate the simpler pleasures of life and has a romance with a simple farmer, and in the end lives a much happier life, though she has been abducted and is more or less imprisoned or at least immured on this farm at the beginning. I think your interpretation is 100% valid. The only way in which I would push back on it is that I do not think Parker Pyne would ever have done that to a male client.
Yep.
And I think that's
absolutely fair. I think that's absolutely fair too. Yeah. I think there's definitely a gendered piece in there. I think he would have absolutely thought twice about taking power of attorney over an entire fortune
of a man. Oh, he wouldn't have done. Absolutely. He wouldn't have done it. I just don't think he would have done it. And of course, that's an extra textual interpretation, but I think it's just one that's supported by the general sense that one gets of the Parker Pyne, of those Miss Lonely Hearts stories. But it's so interesting. And Christie loved telling stories about the differences between men and women. And that's what she was able to really just wallow in and delight in, I think, in those Miss Lonely Heart stories. In some ways, they remind me of some of the work she was doing in her Mary Westmacott's as well. Mm-hmm. It's core Christie. It's absolutely core Christie. And she's exercising a certain muscle that she usually only gets to exercise a tiny bit in her mysteries. It's a little bit like we see her flexing the more fanciful and supernatural side of her psyche in the Mr. Quinn stories, right? And here we see her having fun with the way that men and women interact. And this is a little bit more of the romantic side of her, and one that's very much, of course, stuck in its time, because any relations between men and women are anchored to, the period in which whoever created them lived. And that's why I think some of it is a little hard to swallow now from a 21st century perspective, or from my 21st century perspective. Obviously, people will encounter these in different ways. And Catherine and I think, had a lot of issues with those stories for that reason. But I do love them. And they're so, in their own way, exquisitely crafted, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But for example, like if I'm going to be distressed at any of them and the way the people are treated, both with respect to their fortune, their purchase of services, their result, right? I mean, I would throw the case of the discontented soldier out and keep the case of the rich woman any day.
Yes. Well, and the case of the discontented soldier, let's not forget, has, I think, one of the very worst and most shocking instances of a depiction stuck in its time as to race.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
very hard to read. You can listen back to our episode about that if you would like to know what I'm talking about there. And we do have, and we often do in these Parker Pyne stories, I think because they are so anchored in their time, we have a lot of uncomfortable sentences, such as this one from the Regatta mystery. I am interested in the classification of emotional reactions as exemplified by certain racial types. That is what the statistician, Mr. Parker Pyne, says in this very story. And I'm obviously thinking, well, I don't think that classifying by race does anyone any good, but that seems to be something that Mr. Parker Pyne is interested in here, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it's interesting that it comes up at that place in the story, too, where he's talking to a character, and that is particularly about the fact that the character is Welsh.
Yes.
Of all the things that have already come up in that story with respect to people's ethnic, cultural, racial, and religious backgrounds, the fact that what gets fixed on at that particular point in the story is a person who is Welsh is kind of interesting in and of itself. You know, I would say on the one hand of its time, right, do social scientists even to this day use large data sets to try to make behavioral predictions based on race and ethnicity? Absolutely. So on the one hand of its time in a really uncomfortable and terrible way, on the other hand, sadly timeless in ways that we continue to see reflected in the way we see the world now.
Absolutely. And it's why when Catherine and I started this podcast, we were calling that final category when we would review novels, the stuck in its time category. And we realized when we had listeners call in essentially, or, send us voice memos, that the impression they got is that we were trying to argue that the issues themselves were stuck in a certain time and that they were not timeless, which is why I'm always very careful to now call them depictions stuck in their time, because it's the depiction of the issue in its blunt or bald way that jars for us, not the fact that racism or, stereotyping according to race in statistics or, anything like that. Of course, these things existed then. They exist now. Unfortunately, they will probably be with us forever as long as humans are here on the face of the earth or wherever we move to in space once we've used up this planet. But it's the depiction. And I think it's the way that Parker Pyne seems to be comfortable with playing around with these stereotypes and making judgments and inferences based on these stereotypes. And we can tell that there's an authorial approval of what he's doing. And it feels like Christie's saying, yes, Parker Pyne is wise. Parker Pyne is smart. And when he makes these sort of statements and when he draws these inferences and when he does things, as he does in the case of the rich woman, for example, or even in the case of the discontented soldier, he's doing the right thing. He is ultimately doing the right thing. I mean, the pearl clutching that Catherine and I were doing when we covered those Miss Lonely Heart stories really relates to Christie herself, because we can feel the authorial approval of Christie as to everything Pyne does in these stories. He's not a villain. I don't think that there's a lot of questioning that's happening here in these Pyne stories. His actions are endorsed pretty wholeheartedly, I would say, by Christie. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I think that is a fair statement. And I think throughout this story, we see that theme of the overt or the tacit racial, ethnic, or cultural stereotype played out in a very matter-of-fact way that sort of feels awkward. I think we see the same thing with the characterization of the culprits. When and of course, I've got both the Parker Pyne and the Poirot versions of these stories in front of me all the time that we're talking, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. But when they characterize the Amalfi gang, and they just sort of, it's this gang of people who are Italian, and what that means, they're Italian-American jewel thieves, okay, and the fact that the two diamond merchants themselves are coded as explicitly Jewish. Right.
Yep.
And then we start to get into some more nuanced pieces. So, for example, the way the Marroways are described, Sir George and Lady, and yet they're not quite. The whole thing kind of pulls together in that way. I think a lot of the story kind of hinges on those codes and stereotypes playing out in a way that isn't overtly good.
I agree. I mean, the first line of the story is Mr. Isaac Points removed a cigar from his lips and said approvingly, "Pretty little place." And I wrote in my margin, "Uh-oh." I underlined Isaac Points because with Christie, and especially we're still in early Christie here, anytime a character who you can feel she's coding as Jewish is introduced into the story, I'm worried that there's going to be an anti-Semitic portrayal. She doesn't actually go there, though.
No, it could have been
really
a lot. Could have been a lot worse. Absolutely,
a lot worse. And this is again where we are judging Christie because Christie is the one whose work has survived. And my God, there were way worse examples from detective fiction of the time, from literary fiction of the time, and everything in between. So it's worth pointing. It's always worth mentioning that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be commenting on this, but in this way, it's the fact that she has survived the test of time that allows us to be so harsh on her. She's definitely engaging, like you said, I think in a lot of that coding and stereotyping. And for me, it makes the story feel a little brittle, if that makes sense. And I find that is often the case, actually, with the Parker Pyne stories, and especially those early ones. And I think you're right that when Parker Pyne travels, what we see are more traditional puzzle mysteries. And Christie is just so good when her characters are traveling and when they're on the move and everyone is on shifting sands. And I think it almost frees her up to just engage that much more deeply and thoroughly in the mystery and not to get, in a weird way, as caught up in, the stereotyping of characters. And this is a weird hybrid because we're certainly not in Miss Lonely Hearts territory with this story, but we are also not traveling, as you said, and we are back in England. So it's an interesting one to end on. Also, I think for the reason that you brought up, and this is something that I mentioned earlier in the episode, but this is a curious case where the short story was first written as a Poirot, or at least first published as a Poirot. It was very interesting to me how, I would argue perfunctorily, Parker Pyne replaced Poirot in this story, though there are some interesting substitutions, and I'm curious what you made of them, Michelle. But this is a story where the detective is only coming in after the fact, and where I think it's very easy to make the substitution because he's not threaded in the story in the way that Poirot and Miss Marple sometimes are, but interestingly, in the way that Parker Pyne always is, actually. I mean, we have lots of Marples where, much to our consternation, Miss Marple doesn't come into the story until like halfway through, moving finger, etc. And the same can be said for Poirot. But what's interesting is that Parker Pyne, because he is this consultant, right? He's the heart specialist and he wants to make people happy. People come to him and then the story unfolds from there. And he is, for the most part, I think, pretty thoroughly embedded in these Parker Pyne short stories. And this is the only one where he's not. And it's interesting to me that it started as a Poirot because I almost feel as though she wouldn't have done that from the get-go with a Parker Pyne. And there is a certain awkwardness about that, the fact that it's been changed from a Poirot to a Pyne for that reason.
Well, oh my goodness, have you just waded into a morass there, Kemper? This is going to be really exciting. So let me unspool what you just said, because I had several things that I thought of while you were talking, and then let me come up to the timeline. So first of all, right, you said about the story being brittle, and it's partly brittle because of these stereotypes, but I think you're right. When Parker Pyne, because there is so little intrinsic to his character, when he's traveling, and particularly when he's traveling abroad, and therefore he's forced to, he has to engage with other people outside of his core setting, it allows him to resonate a little bit better because he doesn't have any internal resonance of himself. So when he's interacting with people, when he's traveling, particularly traveling abroad, it gives us some resonance that mitigates that brittleness that I think is kind of intrinsic to Pyne just because of the absence of his character. And what you were saying, right? Parker Pyne, typically in a Parker Pyne story, is the prime mover, right? He's there throughout the whole story, in part because, he's the one who set the whole thing in motion. Sure.
He's the mover and shaker of the story.
Yes, absolutely. And in this case, he's not, although back to the timeline of this story. So now we have to go back to visit with our dear, dear friend, Jamie Bernthal, and his new companion to the mystery fiction. So Jamie has this to say. Received wisdom states that Christie wrote the Regatta mystery in 1936 and then changed her mind and rewrote it as a Parker Pyne for the book in 1939. He says that a close reading of both texts suggests to him that it's more likely that she wrote it as a Pyne story and then changed it to Poirot for the commercial market. And then he offers, and of course, I'm assuming you have the McFarlane's Companion at hand, as we all do these days, right? And you could actually pop up and read what he wrote about it, where he's done his own close read, in particular of some of the changes in dialogue from Pyne to Poirot, and really argues that he thinks it's the other way around. And then he says, nevertheless, the official line is that the stories were written in order of publication. And that is, it was a Poirot that was changed to a Pyne rather than vice versa. However, upon reading that, I went back to my own notes from the wonderful week that I spent in the business papers archive at Exeter University. I say wonderful week because of the content. Those of you who do archival research know that sitting in an uncomfortable chair in a 63-degree archive for 35 hours, by the time I was done, I had a frozen shoulder and one of my legs was numb for several weeks. But it's okay. I was really excited to be there.
And things you scholars do.
Absolutely. Well, when you're in that particular archive, you're allowed to take images of things that were produced by Agatha herself. But other than that, if you're an ordinary old scholar such as myself, all you can do is take notes from the other things. You can't take images of things that Agatha didn't produce. And that's because of the intellectual property rights. So my notes, I found there's a letter from Frederick Danae, who's one half of Ellery Queen. He's doing a bibliography of detective short stories, right? Because he's constantly trying to get the rights to short stories to publish in the Ellery Queen magazine, right? And so this is 1942, we're in the middle of the war, right? So people are everybody's a little bit harried, and there's a lot of correspondence going back and forth. And he's written a letter where he's seeking to clarify the sort of pre-existing distribution of a whole bunch of Agatha Christie short stories. And one of those is the Regatta mystery. And it notes the Regatta mystery, short story collection, US, not England. And then I have written in my handwritten notes, Regatta mystery, Parker Pyne changed to Poirot story. Now, I would have to go back to the archive, but my note from the archive, as well as Bernthal's close reading, indicate that it may perhaps have been a Pyne that was changed to a Poirot, which helps solve some of those problems, and some of them it leaves still a complete and abject mystery, because either way, even if it was originally written as a Parker Pyne story, still, why does he not show up until the end? Why was the original core piece of the story that my family acted out at the dinner table last night to double check how the plot actually worked? Right? Why does that not have either Pyne nor Poirot in it? But I was interested that I was able to kind of do this weird deep dive as I was thinking about this story and looking at the two versions. Because when I originally read them, I was like, she changed a couple of words. These read pretty much the same. And for the first half, that's true. And once the detective is introduced, then the wording is a little bit more changed, which it would have to be because, Poirot's dialogue is inimitable.
Frenchified. Yes. It's funny. I mentioned this earlier in the episode, but John Curran uses Christie's exercise books to theorize precisely what Jamie Bernthal does, which is that this started as a Pyne story. And I admittedly find that very hard to refute, but my educated guess is that it follows the publication chronology, so that it was written first as a Poirot. To me, I think she did write a lot of Poirots where he is shoved in after the fact. This is a pretty extreme example of that. It's one of the most extreme, but it's less jarring to me to read a Poirot in which he appears after the fact and at the very end than it is for me to read a Parker Pyne that's structured that way. It's just so different from all of the other Parker Pynes. And I noticed that in the Regatta mystery, the collection that it first appeared in, the US collection, I believe there's one other Parker Pyne, and then we have a smattering of Poirots and Marples. And it almost feels like you kind of need another Parker Pyne. So it balances out the collection to make the Regatta mystery, the titular mystery of the collection, to make it a Parker Pyne, so that you don't have Poirot's outweighing the Marples and the one lone Parker Pyne that would be there otherwise. But that's right. I'm not basing that on anything. That's just sort of a guess. And this, I think, is an ongoing mystery. But now we're going to have to go back to Exeter and get to the bottom of this, because, why would you have made that note?
I will use any excuse ever, always, to go to Exeter. So I will take that. And by the way, the other Parker Pyne that's in the Regatta mystery is my second favorite Parker Pyne story, which is The Problem at Palencia Bay. Which to me, there's really nothing, except for the very end. And I get why it was a problem to you guys, but still, I absolutely love it. And in part, I love it because of the wonderful use of Madeleine de Serres.
Yes. Oh, Madeleine de Serres story. We were talking about this before we recorded, but Madeleine de Serres is hands down one of the best minor characters in Christie.
Absolutely. And back when I was listening to your and Catherine's original episodes, and you said that you had been caught out, you had been grifted by Maggie Sayers, you didn't realize that Madeleine de Serres wasn't the person, but in fact that Madeleine de Serres was a character, a professional character being played by Maggie Sayers, who actually goes off and has this sort of very mundane, calm, quiet little family life of her own. And I absolutely love it. And so I see that argument about the Regatta mystery as well.
For me, also, the Poirot version read a lot better, I will say. I don't know. I that's probably just confirmation bias. I went into my side-by-side reading thinking that it started as a Poirot and ended as a Pyne. So for me, the Poirot version, where we have so many of those usual tropes, not just his Frenchified dialogue, but he's talking about getting at the truth. And I don't know, the Parker Pyne of it all felt a little shoehorned to me, which is why I still feel like it's probably started as a Poirot and turned into a Pyne, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. I love that this is an ongoing mystery. I mean, for those who have read every single word and every single mystery that Agatha Christie wrote, it's nice to have some sort of a new mystery to cling onto. So let's keep this alive and keep on exploring it.
Absolutely. I love that aspect to it as well, and it's why the work of bibliography is more challenging than one ever might imagine. It doesn't sound hard until you actually start doing it. And of course, I approached Poirot's version of the Regatta mystery in a very different state of mind. I was actually kind of annoyed because I had purchased a copy of the complete Poirot short stories. And it's a big chunky thing. It takes up space on my bookshelf. And then they came out with a newer edition that included Poirot and the Regatta mystery, so that I had to buy another copy. And so now I've got these two kind of big, chunky honkin' bricks of books that take up 6 inches of space on my bookshelf. And the only reason that I had to repurchase it was to get this additional story, which, I was perfectly glad to have. And it's never a bad thing to have multiple copies. You never know when you're going to need to have one upstairs and one downstairs or some other reason. But
this one in the bathroom, maybe, It's time to think inside the box, the BritBox, that is. Did you know that BritBox has curated a collection of the most delicious British village murder mystery series in all the land? Now, when I think village murder, I of course think of the one, the only Miss Jane Marple, and you can indeed find mountains of Marple on BritBox, but there's so much more when it comes to the gentle art of fictional village murder. We've got MacDonald and Dodds, we've got Shakespeare and Hathaway, we've got Father Brown, we've got Sister Boniface, we've even got, and perhaps this is a stretch, but I'm going to include it anyway because it's one of my very favorites, the Cad Files series, starring Derek Jacobi. I'm sure I'm not alone in my love
love for this 90s gem based on the Ellis Peters novels, in which Brother Cadfael and his fearsome fringe face down all sorts of murderous intrigue. So head on over to www.britbox.com, and if you're listening to this in the US or Canada, use coupon code AGATHA to save 50% off the first month of your monthly subscription. You too can begin swimming in the surprisingly fetid and febrile waters, churning just below the surface of all those picturesque high streets dotting the deadly countryside. Well, I have a controversial question to ask you about this story.
Okay.
Christie, I think, almost always plays fair, or perhaps always plays fair. I mean, that's just one of the things that you know where I'm going already. I can hear by your intake of breath, Michelle. I didn't doubt that you knew exactly where I was going with this either. I think she always plays fair. I am one who thinks that The Murder Roger Ackroyd is absolutely fair.
Yes.
And that's part of its brilliance. And I think she skirts the edge over and over and over again, but she always manages not to fall into the abyss of, when you finish a detective novel and you think, hey, wait a second, I was not dealt with fairly here as a reader. And that's very disappointing when it happens. And I think part of it's another one of the many, many answers that we have as to why Christie endures and why she's so popular. It's because we almost never feel that way when we finish a Christie novel, certainly, and most short stories. This short story might be the exception that proves the rule, because it is 3 words that Christie writes here, which I think, given that this is a third-person narration, this is not narrated by Parker Pyne or anyone else in the story. And when Eve Leathern is described early on in the story, the narrator here, our third-person narrator, writes, she was 15. She was not 15. we learn later she was in fact 27. There are ways to finesse that. There could have been one character talking to another saying, oh, yes, she's 15, didn't you know? That's fine, because they believed she was 15. She could have been described as having the apple-cheeked appearance of 15-year-olds everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. That could have been finessed. It was not. I think it's a rare misstep. What do you think?
I don't think it's as bad a misstep as all that. Again, I'm probably going to come back to a similar thing to what I said a few minutes ago about the case of the rich woman, where I said, to what extent is this a lie? To what extent is this the truth? Right? I think people are described in a lot of ways in these stories, some of which are based on the way they are choosing to present to the world.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, I think you're resonating annoyance with it because it was actually intrinsic to the solution of the mystery.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think describing a character in the way they are choosing to present to the world from the perspective of a narrator is as problematic as you feel that it is. And I think it would be much less so if it weren't sort of intrinsic to the solution of the story. What's especially funny about it, of course, is that it didn't even have to be intrinsic to the solution of the story. I mean, we can actually go back and completely unravel this entire thing, and rewrite it if we chose to do so, which I don't think either of us would dare to do.
No, but she could have been 15, right? Like she
could have been 15, or they could have had her present as older and be older, right? And the fact that it kind of doesn't matter, because nobody who sees her at that time could use that piece of information in a meaningful way.
Yeah, well, the fact that she's 15, I think, is significant to the trick that's being played, because they're indulging her as one indulges a child when she says, I want to show you how I would make this jewel disappear. So if she hadn't presented as 15, I think it would be a little weird if she was, a 27-year-old lady who was like, oh, please let me be like,
like, no, that's just weird. Like, no, please.
Yeah, that's just weird.
Yeah,
please be appropriate. I mean, it is one of those tricks too that Christie so often has that works better on the page than, say, on the screen. And this story has never been adapted. Perhaps that's one reason why. It's a little bit like Orphan. I don't
know if you ever saw the movie Orphan.
This is an extraordinary little girl. She's very mature for her age.
It's a similar sort of a trick, and it's a little ridiculous and hard to swallow when you're seeing it. But, this did remind me, I won't get more specific for fear of spoiling, but we have a similar aspect to one of the plot lines in Cat Among the Pigeons, actually. And,
for sure.
We've seen Christie do this before, and my issue isn't that it's not convincing. It's just that to state she was 15 like that feels a little artless to me. And Christie usually is so artful. But I think that is a fair point, that in mysteries, appearances are deceiving. And you could argue that the reader is just being put on notice by virtue of the fact that he or she is reading a mystery, that when anything about appearances, age, what have you, is being stated, it might not be true. And that this is all about appearances and perceptions. And at the end, when that appearance and perception turns out to be false, well, that is just what happens in one of these stories. And we were entirely on notice about that. So again, she's getting really close to the edge. And I think you can defend her, and I'm glad you did. For me, this went slightly over the edge, but I'm glad that it did not for you.
Well, and it may be because, in fact, in this story, it's the actual sleight of hand that always causes me to take a little pause. I think I'm actually probably more distressed over that than I am over the description of her as being 15. And again, that was part of the reason that my family wound up sitting around the dinner table last night. There are several reasons. One of which is that in 1991, my husband took it into his head to make a 3-dimensional plasticine map of Greece and Turkey that hangs in our dining room. So we were talking about whether or not it is plausible that people would just accidentally have plasticine available to them kind of willy-nilly. And of course, we were all like, look, there's plasticine right there on the wall. And we checked, it's still malleable after 31 years.
Wow. Is it really?
Yes, it has not hardened. So we just have this kind of malleable plasticine map of Greece and Turkey that hangs in our dining room. And so we were passing this thing around, and the point where the sleight of hand takes place, I think if you go back and you look at the text, that's the part where I have always with this story been like, I can see that this is pretty much playing fair.
Meaning that you think it's hard to pull off?
Well, I also got to say very loudly in my dining room last night, I couldn't swallow a great thing, all points like that, because somebody asked me as I was acting it out. They were like, well, obviously you just swallowed it. And I said, oh, that's hilarious, because she actually dealt with that in the text. But Mr. Leathern takes it. He says, pretty good. Yes, pretty good, in a somewhat artificial manner. And in his turn, passed it to Llewellyn. The waiters coming in at that moment, there was a slight hitch in the proceedings. When they had gone again, Evan said, very fine stone, and passed it to Leo Stein. So that moment where the jewel actually gets stuck under the plate to a piece of chewing gum in preparation for the waiters coming in and taking it is glossed over by the words, and in his turn, passed it to Llewellyn. Because the waiters actually don't come in until after Llewellyn has it.
Right. The blocking is awkward.
I think the blocking is awkward, right? And, and on the one hand, right, the absolute brilliance of this story is that Christie has desensitized the reader to those waiters. And I think that that's a point of brilliance in this piece that cannot be overstated, actually, is that if you go back, right, those waiters have come in multiple times. Right. And so at this, when you get to this point of very high stress in the story, and as a reader, you're kind of plowing through it, she has really overtly conditioned you to ignore those waiters to the extent that everybody else in the room is ignoring the waiters. And I think that is an absolute unmitigated piece of brilliance that I would not like to take away any of the credit from. But I do think the blocking of Leathern getting the diamond, sticking it under the plate, doing the sleight of hand where now he has to hand a fake to Llewellyn because the real one's gone. It's out of the room at this point, is awkward. But like I said, the waiters, the brilliant finesse of the fact that we've been desensitized to the waiters, I think kind of outweighs it.
And it's something that we see her use to such brilliant effect in a lot of stories, but Death in the Clouds, 3-act tragedy. It's, that's such a core Christie trick overlooking the help, right? I mean, it falls under never underestimate the help.
Underestimate the help, which is actually the very top thing that I have written on my notes for our conversation today. It says, never underestimate the help in all caps. Because what I think is really cool, especially about this one, if we could use the word cool, is that in a lot of those cases, Christie actually overtly has somebody say, oh, like she'll have Poirot or Miss Marple in the one where that's the case, say, oh, nobody ever pays attention to the maid. Nobody ever pays attention to the footman. In this case, she not only has the characters lose track of the waiters, she actually manages to get the reader to lose track of the waiters, which I think is kind of a doubling down on that move that is a special genius, and I think redeems a lot of this story.
Well, and in a case that hinges on its closed nature, right? And that's harped on so many times, that this is a closed circle and there was nothing in or out except for that moment. And that's also what's so brilliant. It's part of the misdirection that she so often employs, which is, a key part of her sleight of hand, which is that we're focused on that moment where the coin is thrown out the window and a newspaper is thrown back up. And we think, okay, well, that is where the isolation of the people in this room was breached. It was that moment. That's why this Welshman is being suspected. And because of that, we're just conditioned in that way to forget, right? About, well, no, there were actually several other moments in which people were in and out, and those could have been significant. And the fact that she's able to do that in a couple of pages, often these tricks that she employs in novels don't work as well in short stories because she isn't able to bury them under as many pages or rich characterization or settings that she's able to create in her novels, but she really did pull it off here in short story form. It does work quite well.
Absolutely. There are a couple of other things that I really like about this particular story, and then a couple of other things that I wanted to say about Parker Pyne or Parker Pyne qua Poirot. But if you had other questions or specific things you wanted to talk about, go ahead and hit me with those.
No, I mean, I would love for you to bring up other aspects of the story that you liked. I mean, I will start us off on one, and it's, I think, my last one that I wanted to bring up, and then please feel free to just go wild. I didn't even mention this while I was summarizing the story in the first part of the episode, but there's a throwaway reference to pilchards. Christie writes, Mr. Poyntz corrected Mr. Leathern as to pilchards being connected with Devon and not Cornwall, and prepared to enjoy his dinner. It's a total throwaway reference. I had no idea what a pilchard was. A pilchard, though, is a sardine or herring. And the idea that there's a reference to a herring in this story, and if we're mystery readers, that of course is a very tiny leap to get from pilchard to herring to red herring, in that this story really does feature a massive red herring, which is that moment when the coin is thrown out the window and the newspaper is tossed back up. When I was reading, wrote in my margin, duh, in that moment, because I was like, oh, well, that's where the stone was passed out, or something is going to be significant about that moment. I thought that I had outsmarted Christie. I was like, oh, Christie, this is such a lazy story. This is so obvious. And then much to my chagrin, it's called out later in the story. Well, no, this is why everyone suspects me, because they're so stupidly focusing on this. And, that red herring aspect to the story is, why I think the solution is as tricky and as devious it is. So I just love that she has this reference to pilchards earlier on in the story. And I didn't look that up until after I had finished and I was doing my notes for our conversation. And I thought, oh, Agatha Christie. And this is what happens. Tony Medewer, I think, spoke about it so beautifully on our Sleeping Murder episode. But when you start doing the work and really looking at everything Christie was doing when it comes to titles, throwaway references like this, there are layers upon layers upon layers of intrigue and mischief that she is creating here in these stories. And it's why she really is worth the close read. I mean, I've been doing this for 6 years now, so clearly I'm convinced of that. But it still is something that I feel like you have to convince people of, some of them even casual readers of Christie. And it happens to me every day when people ask me what I do and I talk about doing this podcast for Agatha Christie, and I can feel some people being like, really? Agatha Christie? Like, how you devote that much time? It's like, yes, you devote this much time because this is the kind of stuff that she's doing. And I love that we had an example of that in this story.
It's really kind of funny because, especially when she was at her peak, there's almost no case where you could sort of overestimate her and what she was doing, right? Because she was just always doing everything.
Yeah.
And the fact that she was always doing everything and it's all so incredibly readable is still just causes me to hold my head still to this day every time. But the other thing
she doesn't draw attention to it. She's not drawing attention to any of these things that and that's part of the power, right? That's the readability, but it's so easy to overlook. It's so frustrating, right? Because it makes it so easy to overlook.
Well, yeah. And I mean, people say to me, they're mysteries. Once you found out who done it, how can you reread them? And I'm like, oh, now you've done it. Now you just need to sit down because now we're going to have a conversation that's going to involve me talking to you for 6 hours. So I hope you're comfortable. But the other thing that I love about this story is that, one of the things, and a lot of people bring this up about Christie, but one person in particular who brings it up frequently, as far as I'm concerned, is Mark Aldrich, who constantly talks about how funny she is.
Mm-hmm.
And she's so funny. And there are some just absolute laugh out loud moments in this story. One of which I don't even think it means to be funny at all. It's just that to an American in 2022, the idea of sitting down hungrily to a plate of hot mackerel, which is one of the very first things that happens after they come to the table. And I like mackerel as well as the next person. It's quite healthy fish. I eat it a fair bit, but sitting down to an appetizing plate of hot mackerel just to this day, something, I mean, it sounds funny, right? The syllables are funny. But what I like too is that it's another fish. And I, in fact, wound up down the rabbit hole of what's the difference between a sardine and a mackerel and why are they different? Why do they both show up in this story? So I think it's interesting that we both glommed onto that fish piece because of what she said, but I think also because of the place. Right? When you might say to me, why does it matter where this was set? Well, this is set at Dartmouth Harbor. It's the Regatta mystery. They were on a yacht, right? This actually comes in. This is one of those cases where I so much wish that I could talk right now to Tina Hodgkinson, who is one of the world's experts in Christie's places, right? And talk about Dartmouth Harbor and what's Parker Pyne doing in Dartmouth Harbor and what meaning does that bring to this particular story, in addition to the hot mackerel and the pilchards. So the fact that she really is using the place, it's not just an accident, but it actually comes in. I love the fact that she just slides Samuel Leathern in there. Now, come on, she describes him as an American business acquaintance, not exactly precisely what he is either, but there he is. I love it when Eve says, you've got gangsters in England as well as we have. Another thing Christie was always so great at was literally telling you what's going on. And that you don't hear it, right? I mean, the Five Little Pigs, which was my favorite Agatha Christie novel before it became in vogue for that to be people's favorite Agatha Christie novel. Thank you.
You loved it
very
first.
much for that. No, everything with Agatha, right? She did it first. She did it best. I may have glommed onto Five Little Pigs for many years ago, but I think you and Catherine were able to articulate the reasons why that's the case, obviously better than anybody ever has. And so I thank you for that. But
I appreciate that.
Absolutely. But this is one of those cases where she lays a fact out on the table literally in front of you. And just as a reader, since you don't know what to do with it, you don't do anything with it.
Right.
And it turns out it's me. I'm the gangster.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. No, that's it. I mean, that's what Christie does. And that's also why, why do you reread these mysteries? Well, once you know the answer, and then you can actually see the crafting that's going on there and how she's just feeding it to you.
Because Five Little Pigs, you don't actually have to read past the first couple of pages to actually know who did it, because she literally tells you.
Yeah.
She literally tells you. And I've gone back and read the opening of that book so many times to be like, okay, how, I don't know. She just gets it right by you. And the Regatta mystery, I love Lady Marroway's grim tone after they come out from searching Eve behind the screen. And she's like, you can take it from me. Because Mr. Points would be quite ready to take it from her.
I'm like, what happened behind that screen? Wow. Okay.
Well, as we said last night at the dinner table, they went behind the screen in the corner of the room because there's always a screen.
Yep. Of course.
And, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and this is what I was also going to ask you, since you literally have plasticine hanging up in your dining room for decades now. What is the consistency? Is it like silly putty or is it harder than that?
Oh, a silly putty would run, right?
I guess it
silly
would,
putty is more
right?
like a non-Newtonian fluid, right? If you had it hanging on your wall, it just eventually, it would go onto the floor probably within a few days.
Yeah, I guess that's true. So it's a lot harder than that. Like, but if you stuck your thumb into it right now, would you be able to press down on it or like get the imprint of your thumb?
Absolutely. Like right now, you could take an absolutely beautifully clear set of fingerprints in the plasticine on my dining room wall right now if you wanted to.
But you'd have to press really hard.
What you can see is that you would have to press not as hard as you might think. It's a really intriguing matter, actually, if you're looking at it from kind of a material science perspective, because like I said, it's been hanging on our dining room wall. And this is a map of Greece and Turkey. So you might imagine there are little teeny tiny mountains because it's a topographical map. And I think if you look very, very closely at it, you'll see that the very, very tops of the mountains might have developed the tiniest bit of a point downward toward the floor in answering to gravity, but it hasn't run the way you might imagine silly putty would. It hasn't hardened like clay would. It's a unique substance. And I think that actually adds something to the story.
I feel like maybe we should end on the high point of waxing poetic about the wonders of plasticine. That seems appropriate for Parker Pyne and Agatha Christie in general. Although you pretty much answered my question. I was going to ask you what your favorite Christie novel is. So would you still say Five Little Pigs, even though everyone else is saying it now too?
Here's the thing. When it was just me, I didn't mind. And when it's everybody, I don't mind because I do bear the conviction of my opinions. And so I still, Five Little Pigs, absolutely. That would be my Desert Island Christie if I had to take one with me. So where I sort of get into contrarian land is that I really like A Pocketful of Rye, which is not typically what people place as one of their top Marple novels. But I have a huge fondness for A Pocketful of Rye and will continue to defend that one even as no one other than me continues to do so, in part because of the character of Mary Dove, who I think is absolutely one of the most brilliant minor characters, and her relationship with Inspector Neil is quite lovely. But Five Little Pigs is just as close to perfect as it comes. The writing is spot on. The puzzle is brilliant. The characters are fantastic. I mean, nothing that you haven't already covered, but there's really very little not to love about it.
I did get a jar of marmalade out of Pocketful of Rye because on the episode where Catherine and I discussed that novel, I talked about how I had been partaking of fairly sugary, subpar marmalade, which is why I was surprised to learn that marmalade is actually supposed to be somewhat bitter since it has lots of orange peel in it. Smucker's orange marmalade is pretty sweet. And at the International Agatha Christie Festival, which you, of course, attended and where I did an event, two lovely, lovely listeners came up and bestowed a jar of high quality orange marmalade on me. And I so appreciated it. It was a lovely gift to get. And I have not acknowledged that before now. So thank you for reminding me of that. And I have to say, Pocketful of Rye is one of those novels that I think we were a little harsh on it when we reviewed it, and it has aged very well. Very, very well. I actually have a lot of, I won't say fondness for it, because I think in a lot of ways it's a very unpleasant novel and it's meant to be, but I have a lot of respect for Pocketful of Rye. So I love that answer as a sort of a close second, shall we say, or just one that you hold in high esteem. I feel like we all have those novels. Mine is The Murder at the Vicarage. I would never say it's my favorite Christie, but I love it so much that I always feel the need to talk about it. If people ask me like, what Christies do you love? And I'm always like, oh, Murder at the Vicarage. It's so wonderful.
Well, and I like Christie at her unpleasant, right? I think you and Catherine really articulated that the Parker Pyne stories are in many ways unpleasant. The Parker Pyne himself is unpleasant. Maybe it is that A Pocketful of Rye really resonates with me because I do gravitate toward the Christies where she's really looking with a quite open eye at unpleasant people doing really unpleasant things.
I love that. And then I feel like you identified both The Case of the Rich Woman and Problem at Palencia Bay as your second favorite Parker Pyne in the course of this conversation. What's your favorite Parker Pyne? Or was that The Case of the Rich Woman that would be your favorite one?
I think those two would switch back and forth in my mind quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
They're completely different. I mean, I like them for completely different reasons. They're completely different kinds of stories. They're completely different in their approach toward, the value of humanity, I think. And I think that I could easily flip-flop them back and forth between my favorite. The image at the end of the case of the rich woman, the visual image at the end of that is just so lovely. But the game in Problem at Palenza Bay is so fantastic.
Yeah.
They're both my favorite.
Together, they give a good sense of the breadth of Parker Pyne's stories, what she's doing. I think you can almost get like a holistic sense of what Christie achieved when she was writing Parker Pyne stories, because it really was two different things, very simply stated. I'm of course oversimplifying in that way, but given that we have those Miss Lonely Hearts in the first half of the Parker Pyne Investigates collection, and then the roving puzzle mysteries. Yeah, I actually have a lot of, I'll just say, affection for the Parker Pyne stories, not for Parker Pyne himself, although I think he's a fascinating character. And this occurred to me while you were speaking earlier, Michelle, about the fact that we know so little about Parker Pyne, and that how that allows the mysteries to resonate all that much more. That, I think, is a quality that all of Christie's detectives share to a certain extent. People are always saying, oh, why don't we know more about Poirot's backstory? And did Miss Marple ever love anyone when she was younger? Like, why is she single? Why does Poirot not have a partner? And, can we know more about their families? And no, we can't, because Christie made that decision. And I think she made that decision for the very writerly reason that the fact that we know so little about them is what allows them to function as brilliantly as they do in these mysteries, and as the detectives who ultimately tell us what the solution is and guide us through these mysteries. That was her decision. And I think it's a little bit more stark as to Parker Pyne. It's a little more obvious in these stories, like, wow, this is someone about whom we know next to nothing. We do get a little bit more in terms of Poirot interacting with Hastings and Miss Marple's fellow citizens within St. Mary Mead. She exists within a community, so it feels a little bit more filled out. But at the end of the day, at the end of each of these stories, there really is very little, and that's a very Christie-ish thing. So I think in some ways you could say Parker Pyne is almost the most Christie-ish of detectives in the enigma that he is to us as readers. And I like that, actually.
I do too. But can I call out you and Catherine for one little red herring that you've drawn across the listeners' trail?
Yes, please.
May I? When you talked about the Parker Pyne story, Death on the Nile.
Yes.
You talked about the Poirot novel, Death on the Nile, because they happen to share a title, and I guess happen to share a setting. But as you and I were talking about the Regatta mystery today, which is a Parker Pyne and a Poirot story, I would say that when you compared Parker Pyne's Death on the Nile to Poirot's Death on the Nile, that you were intentionally drawing a red herring across our trail. Because I think as readers, if we really want to feel that difference between what happens when a story is a Parker Pyne story or when the same story is a Poirot story, what we actually should look at is Poirot's The Cornish Mystery. And if you sit down and you read Poirot's Cornish Mystery and Pyne's Death on the Nile, what you really do get to see there is what happens when you take the same story and really deeply recast it so that it's appropriate for each of those protagonists. And I think it's a much richer comparative experience for it.
That is so brilliant. And I will just call myself out here. I cannot speak for Catherine, obviously. But when we covered Parker Pyne's Death on the Nile, we had not yet covered The Cornish Mystery. So I simply was unaware of the fact that they were similar. This just came up in the last two episodes of this podcast where I covered SOS from the Hound of Death collection and then the Harlequin tea set, which was the final Mr. Quinn, Mr. Satterthwaite story. And they are the exact same story. Christie did this with her novels, and I made the argument in the Harlequin tea set episode that I don't think she did it as brilliantly with these two short stories as she did with the novels, because I'm not sure that the intention was there, as it very much is, I think, when she's doing what she did did as to The Mysterious Affair at Styles and Death on the Nile, the novel, for example. But I think that's such a worthwhile exercise, actually. I also would encourage readers to read Parker Pyne's Death on the Nile and then read The Cornish Mystery. Listen to our podcast episode of The Cornish Mystery as well, because wow, they are so different, right? Because one is a Poirot story and one is a Pyne story. And even though the mystery is the same, the puzzle is the same, you can feel what Christie did to make a story, a Poirot story versus a Pyne story, in a much more thorough and interesting way than any of the differences I think we can find between the Pyne version of the Regatta mystery and the Poirot version of the Regatta mystery. Because again, whichever detective it is, he's really only there for a couple of pages at the end. And it's just not as thorough of a Pyne or a Poirot story. But I think that would be a really interesting exercise. And I honestly wish that we had known about that and we would have done that. So you schooled us, Michelle. And I like to be schooled because it's an excellent point. And I think it actually does show some of the vital differences between Poirot and Pyne and what we might love about what Christie does in those stories. And there is a sort of stripped out quality to the Parker Pyne short stories, both the Miss Lonely Hearts and the Traveling Ones, all the Parker Pyne stories. There's this Spartan quality to them that I really like, and that is very different from anything else Christie did, and in some ways is almost the inverse of the Quinn Satterthwaites, because those are filled with a lot more. Those are, sort of a post-impressionist painting version of like what Christie does in a mystery, whereas these are like Baroque, or I don't even know what analogy I want to make as to painting, but it's different. And yet still Christie. And that's so interesting,
It is. And and that's funny, right? Because when people are like, oh, the Harley Quinns, those are her, her hidden masterpiece, the lost jewel of the Christie. And you have to, and I'm like, yes, but can I tell you about Parker Pyne? And they're like, what? And I think it depends on what resonates with readers, and the fact that Christie was able to resonate with readers who would appreciate all of that over the course of her career, just yet another one of the things that is so brilliant about her.
And even though you have come on this podcast to talk about Parker Pyne and have done so brilliantly now for quite a while, and I so appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with me about this final Parker Pyne short story. It's so lovely to be able to be in conversation with someone else and not just monologuing as I have been forced to do now in these post-Catherine days. So thank you, Michelle, for coming on. We've covered a lot of territory I never would have, certainly on my own, and I so appreciate that. But I am not going to let you go without foisting the Sophie's Choice I insist on every one of my guests making on this podcast. Poirot or Marple?
Marple.
I love it. Oh, I love it. This is just, I love how quickly you said it. I kind of knew you sort of gave it away. I think earlier on you were talking about how Miss Marple is your first love. And I was like, oh, she's one of mine. I can tell.
That's no Sophie's Choice for me. That's the, not even close. And Poirot's lovely. I mean, there's nothing, absolutely no, there's nothing wrong with him. I mean, who says that, but I just, Miss Marple there's nothing I like better than an underestimated, brilliant woman.
Truth. Well, Michelle, thank you again. This has been wonderful. I look forward to seeing you at another conference somewhere in the world very soon.
Absolutely, especially since you've given me yet another excuse to go back to Exeter. I'm sure I'll find myself over that way very, very soon. Thank you so much. This has just been absolutely brilliant. And I'm so grateful to be here, grateful to get to talk to you, grateful to get to talk about Parker Pyne. So thank you so much.
That is the Regatta mystery, Pyne and Poirot versions both. Thank you again to Dr. Michelle Kazmer for a scintillating conversation about this story and Parker Pyne generally, and for all her insights into the Christie oeuvre. You can find Michelle on Twitter at Michelle Kazmer, MichellelleKazmer, and on the web at mkazmer.org. I'm really thrilled to have been able to add her voice to the chorus of experts Catherine and I have had on the podcast by now. She's a crucial addition. And speaking of experts, the time is finally upon us for one last State of the Rankings episode, in which I take stock of our grid, which now features all 66 of Agatha Christie's novels. But you didn't think I was going to try to do a rankings episode alone, did you? Just as I leaned on friends of the podcast to help me with the ranking of each of the last 6 novels in the aftermath of Catherine's passing, I am now going to lean on one more friend for this final rankings review, and he's a biggie. No, he is not David Suchet. At this point, I worry that if I ever do have David Suchet on the podcast, it'll be a huge disappointment. He's been teased so many times. No, my co-host for this episode is none other than BFF of the podcast, John Curran, author of Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, and for that reason, hands down the best qualified person in the world to spar and bicker with me about this behemoth of a grid. I am beyond excited. Jessie Spano and her diet pills are going to have to take a back seat because the lather I'm in over this episode is truly on another level. So that's in 2 weeks' time. And in the meantime, you can, of course, always head on over to the podcast's Patreon page for bonus content. My December episode, which drops in 3 days' time, is all about 2 Christmas-themed short stories by Edmund Crispin, who is my favorite minor author of the golden age of detective fiction. I'll also be doing a little informal review of all the Christmas-themed mystery anthologies out there, because there are a lot of them, and pulling out 1 or 2 and indulging in a whole passel of short Christmas-themed murder mysteries is one of my very favorite things to do around the holidays. So that's over at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha, Patreon, or just click the link in the notes to this episode. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And if you haven't yet done so, please give the podcast a rating and or a review. It would be a wonderful end of year, perhaps holiday themed gift for me and for the show. Always appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Fill your summer with the sun-kissed sweetness of Amigos Refreshers. There's strawberry acai, blueberry dragon fruit, and mango passion fruit, each a tropical delight. So skip the hot coffee and amp up your day with the plant-based natural caffeine and fruity flavor fusions in an Amigos Refresher. These cool thirst quenchers are just $3.99, or there's a mega 32-ounce size for $4.99. Recharge with the bold, fresh flavor of an energizing refresher at Amigos.
If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.